Welcome to Roots of Fear. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of Virginia's past, to a wedding celebration that would become one of the 19th century's most perplexing mysteries. What you are about to hear has been assembled from court testimonies, personal diaries, whispered accounts passed down through generations, and newspaper articles. The story of the Thorn Family Wedding is one that has, for over a century, eluded explanation. It is a tale where the line between history and nightmare blurs with each telling. The year was 1871. The Civil War had ended just 6 years prior, leaving Virginia forever changed. Still reeling from the devastation of battle, the burning of Richmond, and the collapse of the plantation economy that had for generations defined Southern aristocracy, the once proud state was in turmoil. Reconstruction policies had upended social hierarchies, creating tensions between those who clung desperately to the remnants of antebellum traditions and those who embraced the new order. Industry was slowly replacing agriculture as the economic backbone, the railroads were expanding, and freed slaves were attempting to forge new lives amid profound uncertainty and hostility. In this era of profound transition, a few old Virginia families, through shrewd investments, adaptability, or less savory means, managed to maintain their status and wealth. Among these survivors were the Thorns. Their fortune, originally built on tobacco and later diversified into railroad interests, iron, and timber, had emerged from the war diminished, yet far from destroyed. They belonged to that resilient class of Southern aristocracy that bent but did not break under the winds of change. In the rolling hills outside of Milboro Springs, Virginia, Thorn Manor stood. Like a declaration of permanence, the grand house rose from the landscape. 3 stories of red brick and white columns, its curved driveway was lined by ancient oak trees whose sprawling branches formed a natural archway for approaching carriages. The Thorn family had inhabited this land since before the Revolution. Their roots ran deep in Virginia soil. Their name was etched into the memories of locals, church registries, and county records for generations. They were old money, the kind that survived depressions, wars, and the changing tides of fortune through means that locals sometimes questioned in hushed whispers. Strange lights were seen at midnight from the manor's highest windows. Servants arrived healthy and vibrant, only to wither within months of employment. On nearby farms, livestock was found exsanguinated with no predator tracks to be found. These whispers never reached the level of accusation. The Thorns were too powerful, too essential to the region's economy, but they persisted like morning mist in the valleys, impossible to dismiss entirely, yet intangible. The patriarch in 1871 was Ezekiel Thorn. At 57, he cut an imposing figure, tall and lean, with a shock of silver hair that had once been raven black, and eyes of such a deep green they appeared almost black in certain lights. A stern man with a reputation for unwavering expectations for his family and shrewdness in business, Ezekiel had guided the Thorn holdings through the tumultuous war years with a calculated precision that impressed even his northern competitors. He had served briefly in the Confederate Army as a colonel, more from obligation than conviction, and had returned to civilian life early enough to protect his assets from the conflict's worst ravages. His wife, Margaret, had passed 3 winters before from consumption, leaving him to manage both his 5 children and his estate alone. Those who had known Margaret described her as Ezekiel's temperamental opposite, gentle where he was harsh, warm where he was cold, accessible where he was remote. Her death had left a void in Thorn Manor that seemed not to diminish with time, but to deepen. Servants whispered that after her passing, the master had changed, becoming more reclusive, more obsessed with his family's ancient history, and prone to locking himself in the library for days with only brandy and strange, leather-bound books for company. The eldest of Ezekiel's children was Evelyn Thorn. At 23, she was considered by many to be approaching spinsterhood, her prospects for marriage dwindling with each passing season. This wasn't for a lack of beauty. By all accounts, Evelyn possessed the classical features that marked the Thorn lineage: high cheekbones, a complexion like fine porcelain, and piercing green eyes. Her figure was slender yet graceful, her posture impeccable from years of stern governesses who tolerated nothing less than perfection from the Thorn daughters. Evelyn had been educated far beyond the standards typical for young women of her era. Ezekiel, despite his traditional views in many respects, believed in cultivating intelligence in all his children, regardless of gender. Tutors from Europe and even Boston had been brought to Thorn Manor to instruct the Thorn offspring in literature, mathematics, languages, and natural philosophy. An eager and capable student, Evelyn had proven to be, developing particularly strong affinities for astronomy and botany, interests that would later factor significantly in the events that transpired. Some said it was her temperament that kept suitors at bay, a certain independent streak, a tendency to speak her mind when convention demanded demure silence, an unsettling habit of staring into space as if seeing things invisible to others. Others whispered it was her father's intimidating presence. Few knew the true reason was Evelyn's secret affection for a man her father would never approve of. James Sullivan was the son of Irish immigrants who had come to Virginia seeking work after the potato famine. With nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate determination to survive, his family had arrived in America. Thomas Sullivan, James' father, had found employment at the Thorn Iron Works, advancing quickly from general laborer to skilled craftsman due to metalworking skills passed down through generations of his family in County Cork. The Sullivans had settled in the modest worker housing in Millborough Springs, their lives defined by Catholic devotion, hard work, and the close-knit bonds of the small Irish community that had formed around the industrial operations. James had grown up alongside the Thorn children, though always separated by the invisible but impenetrable barrier of class. As a boy, he would sometimes catch glimpses of the Thorn offspring during community events or church services. The Catholic Sullivans attended St. Mary's while the Episcopal Thorns worshipped at Christ Church, their paths crossing only in the neutral territory of town festivals or Independence Day celebrations. He was handsome in a rugged way, with the broad shoulders and powerful build of a man accustomed to physical labor. His hands were calloused from years of work, first helping his father at the forge and later in his own right as he developed his skills. Unlike many of his peers, James possessed a quick mind and a natural aptitude for mechanical principles and figures that had enabled him to rise to the position of foreman at the Thorn Iron Works by the age of 26, an achievement unprecedented for an Irish immigrant's son in post-war Virginia. Education had come to James through less conventional channels than Evelyn's rarefied tutoring. His mother, Bridget Sullivan, had been a school teacher in Ireland before the famine forced their immigration. In the evenings, by lamplight in their modest home, she had taught James and his 3 younger siblings to calculate, read, and write with a thoroughness that surpassed many formal schools of the day. This foundation, combined with James' voracious appetite for knowledge, led him to spend his rare free hours reading borrowed books on metallurgy, engineering, and business principles, subjects that would serve him well as he climbed the ranks at the ironworks. By chance, Evelyn and James had met during one of her botanical expeditions along Chestnut Creek, which wound through Thorn property before joining the Jackson River to the east. The spring of 1869 had been unusually wet, the creek swollen with rainwater and moving with treacherous speed. Intent on examining a rare orchid species she had spotted on a previous excursion, Evelyn had ventured too close to the undermined bank. She had slipped on the mossy stones and would have been swept into the rushing current had James not happened upon the scene at that precise moment. He had been checking water levels for the ironworks operations upstream when he heard her startled cry. Without hesitation, he had lunged forward, catching her arm and pulling her to safety with a strength that both startled and impressed her. That moment of contact, his strong hands steadying her, their eyes meeting in surprise and then something more, had kindled a fire that burned in secret for nearly 2 years. Evelyn had been raised to view men like James as beneath her station, suitable as employees, but never as equals, or heaven forbid, suitors. Yet something in his direct gaze, the quiet confidence with which he had ensured her safety without condescension or expectation of gratitude, had challenged everything she had been taught about class distinctions. For James's part, the encounter had been equally transformative. He had grown up seeing the Thorn family as remote figures, wealthy, powerful, and as distant as stars in the night sky. Evelyn had been a name, occasionally glimpsed at church or town functions, but never a real person in his mind. That day by the creek, as he helped her gather the botanical specimens she had dropped in her nearfall, listening to her speak with genuine passion about the flora of the region, he had seen past the Thorn name to the woman herself, intelligent, curious, and surprisingly lacking in the haughty condescension he had expected from someone of her background. Their clandestine courtship had progressed in stolen moments. Notes were passed through trusted servants, brief encounters in the town bookshop where Evelyn would linger over botanical texts while James pretended interest in agricultural manuals, and occasional twilight meetings at the edge of the Thorn property, chaperoned only by whippoorwills and fireflies. They discovered shared interests beyond what either would have predicted, a mutual fascination with the natural world, with poetry that spoke to the changing American landscape, with mechanical innovations featured in scientific journals. It was a courtship conducted entirely in whispers and glances, in words written and burned, in the language of restraint that only heightened the intensity of their connection. They both recognized the impossibility of their situation in the social context of 1870s Virginia. Yet neither could bring themselves to end what had become essential to their happiness. It was during one such meeting on a warm evening in early June, 1871, that James had finally given voice to what had been growing between them for months. The setting sun had painted the western sky in hues of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the wildflower meadow where they had arranged to meet. Evelyn had arrived breathless, having slipped away from a dinner with her father's business associates by pleading a headache. James had been waiting with a small book of Wordsworth's poetry, a shared favorite, and a wild determination born of weeks of internal debate. When she appeared through the trees, her dark hair slightly disheveled from her hurried journey, he had known with sudden clarity that he could no longer pretend their relationship could exist indefinitely in this twilight state of neither acknowledged nor denied. He had knelt in the soft grass and asked for Evelyn's hand, offering not a ring. He could afford nothing worthy of a thorn, but a promise to spend his life ensuring she never regretted choosing love over luxury, connection over convention. Without hesitation, she had accepted, her heart overriding the rational part of her mind that knew the storm this would bring. And storm it did. When Evelyn, summoning courage she hadn't known she possessed, announced her intention to marry James Sullivan, Ezekiel Thorn had initially frozen in disbelief. The library where this confrontation occurred fell so silent that the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo like thunder. Then, as the full import of his daughter's declaration registered, Ezekiel's famous temper had erupted with volcanic force. The walls of Thorn Manor had trembled with his fury. No daughter of his would marry beneath her station. No Thorn would dilute their bloodline with the son of penniless immigrants. He had hurled accusations of ingratitude, of mental instability, even of demonic influence that would have been laughable in a less fraught context. Servants found excuses to be anywhere but within earshot of the library, though the volume of Ezekiel's rage made complete avoidance impossible. Evelyn had stood her ground with a firmness that surprised even herself, perhaps the first time in her life she had directly opposed her father's will. "I love him," she had stated simply, as if those 3 words could bridge the chasm of class, expectation, and familial obligation that separated her from her heart's desire. "Love," Ezekiel had scoffed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper more terrifying than his shouts. "What does a girl of your sheltered existence know of love? This is infatuation, a common working man's manipulation of an inexperienced mind. I've seen his type before, ambitious, reaching above his station, seeing in you not a woman to cherish, but a path to fortune and position." The argument had continued for hours, spiraling through threats, pleas, accusations, and finally a terrible silence when Ezekiel had declared that she was no daughter of his if she pursued this madness. He had ordered her to her room, proclaiming that she would remain there until this fever broke and sanity returned. For 3 days, with meals delivered by the housekeeper and no contact with the outside world permitted, Evelyn had remained in this state of genteel imprisonment, alternating between rage, tears, and a deepening resolve. She had begun planning an elopement, going so far as to pack a small bag with essential items and write letters to her siblings explaining her decision. On the 4th morning, as she was considering how to smuggle a message to James, a knock had come at her bedroom door. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, a thin, perpetually worried woman who had served the Thorns for over 20 years, had entered with a breakfast tray and an unexpected message. Ezekiel requested his daughter's presence in the library at her earliest convenience. The older woman's expression had revealed nothing, but the slight tremor in her hands as she set down the tray suggested something unusual in the master's demeanor. Evelyn had dressed carefully, steeling herself for another confrontation. She descended the grand staircase with measured steps, her mind racing through arguments she might present, counterpoints to her father's inevitable objections. The heavy mahogany door of the library had seemed more imposing than ever as she raised her hand to knock. What happened next was something no one in Virginia society had anticipated. After a night locked in his study, emerging only to demand brandy from his terrified servants, Ezekiel Thorn had emerged the following morning with an announcement that shocked the household. The wedding would proceed with his blessing. More shocking still were the details. The ceremony would take place at Thorn Manor itself, not in the small family chapel on the grounds, as was tradition, but in the grand ballroom that had not been used since before the war. The guest list would include not only the upper echelons of Virginia society, but also the Sullivan family and their associates. No expense would be spared. It would be, Ezekiel declared, a wedding to remember for generations. The abrupt reversal confounded everyone, none more so than Evelyn herself. When she cautiously questioned her father, he merely patted her hand with uncharacteristic gentleness and said, "Family traditions must be honored, my dear. Some things are more important than personal feelings." His eyes, as he spoke these words, had held an unusual gleam, not anger or resignation, but something akin to triumph, even anticipation. This cryptic statement might have caused more concern had Evelyn not been so relieved. Whatever had changed her father's mind was a blessing, as far as she was concerned. The following weeks were a flurry of preparations. Invitations were dispatched to over 100 guests, their cream parchment emblazoned with the Thorn family crest, a thorny branch encircling a single eye. Seamstresses from Richmond were summoned to create Evelyn's gown of ivory silk and chantilly lace, working to a design Ezekiel himself had sketched with surprising attention to detail. The finest caterers from Richmond were commissioned to prepare a feast worthy of royalty. Throughout this period, Ezekiel displayed a level of involvement in the wedding arrangements that bewildered the household. This was a man who had previously considered such matters beneath his notice, yet suddenly he had opinions on everything from the floral arrangements to the precise timing of the ceremony. He insisted that the wedding must take place at sunset on October 15th, a date that held no obvious significance, but which he declared was auspicious for a Thorn bride. Most peculiar was his insistence on personally reviewing the guest list multiple times, adding names of distant acquaintances and even people with whom the Thorns had historically had strained relations. When the final count reached 108 invitees, an unusually specific number, he had nodded with satisfaction and ordered that no further additions or subtractions be made, regardless of circumstance. The Sullivans, meanwhile, regarded this turn of events with cautious optimism tinged with disbelief. The invitation to the wedding, delivered by Ezekiel's personal secretary rather than through the mail, had struck Thomas and Bridget Sullivan like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. They had been prepared to lose their son to elopement and subsequent ostracism, perhaps even to violence given Ezekiel Thorn's fearsome reputation. This apparent acceptance was so unexpected that their first reaction had been suspicion. James's mother, Bridget, crossed herself whenever Ezekiel's name was mentioned and whispered prayers in Gaelic when she thought no one was listening. A deeply superstitious woman whose childhood in rural Ireland had been steeped in folk beliefs and cautionary tales, she sensed something amiss in this sudden reversal. "There's an ill wind behind this change of heart," she warned her son. "The Thorns have never embraced our kind without purpose, and rarely for good." His father, Thomas, was equally wary, though more pragmatic in his concerns. A man who had survived famine, crossing the Atlantic in a disease-ridden ship, and the prejudices faced by Irish immigrants in America, Thomas Sullivan had developed a finely honed sense for detecting threats to his family's welfare. "Men like Thorn don't change their minds without reason," he counseled his son one evening as they sat on the porch of their modest home. "And rarely for good ones. Whatever blessing his offering comes with a price not yet named." James acknowledged his parents' wisdom but was too deeply in love to heed the warning signs. His focus was on the future, a future with Evelyn, unimaginable just weeks before, yet now apparently within reach. When Ezekiel offered him a position managing the western expansion of the Thorn businesses after the wedding, a position that would provide status and wealth beyond anything the Sullivans had known, James interpreted it as a peace offering, a chance to prove his worth to his future father-in-law. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparations and subtle tensions. Evelyn and James managed only a handful of proper meetings, always chaperoned by Evelyn's younger sister, Charlotte, or by Mrs. Winters. During these brief encounters, They spoke of their future plans, where they would live. Ezekiel had offered them the use of a smaller house on the Thorn property, James's new position, Evelyn's hope to establish a conservatory for her botanical studies. If James noticed a certain distraction in Evelyn's manner, a tendency to fall silent mid-sentence and stare into the middle distance, he attributed it to the natural nervousness of a bride approaching her wedding day. What he couldn't know was that Evelyn's distraction stemmed from increasingly disturbing dreams that plagued her nights. Dreams of standing at the altar in a gown that constricted like a snake with each breath, of guests whose faces shifted and blurred when she tried to focus on them, of her father standing behind her groom with an ancient knife raised high. She dismissed these nightmares as wedding anxiety, though a part of her wondered if they might be her subconscious expressing doubts about her father's too convenient change of heart. As the wedding day approached, strange occurrences began to plague Thorn Manor with increasing frequency. Servants reported hearing whispers in empty rooms, not the usual creaks and settlings of an old house, but distinct voices speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension. Objects disappeared only to reappear in unexpected places. Evelyn's mother's cameo found in the garden when it should have been locked in a jewelry box, a silver candlestick from the dining room discovered in the attic, Ezekiel's pocket watch located in the hollow of an oak tree half a mile from the house. Most disturbing was an incident involving the Thorn family portrait gallery. This long hallway on the second floor contained paintings of Thorn ancestors dating back to the family's arrival in Virginia. At the center, larger than the others, hung the imposing figure of Ezekiel's grandfather, Josiah Thorn, the man who had expanded the family holdings from a modest tobacco plantation to the diverse business empire it had become. One morning, a scullery maid entering to dust found this portrait slashed from frame to base, the canvas hanging in tatters as if attacked by a wild animal. No one admitted to entering the gallery during the night, and the doors had been locked as usual, the key in Mrs. Winters's possession. Ezekiel's reaction to the vandalism had been unexpectedly calm. Rather than the rage the household had braced for, he had merely nodded as if confirming something long suspected and ordered the damaged painting removed. "It seems grandfather disapproves of the match," he had remarked cryptically, then added with a cold smile, "but his time has passed. The future belongs to the living." Most disturbing were the dreams that afflicted not just Evelyn, but everyone residing in Thorn Manor. As the wedding day drew closer, every member of the household, from the lowest scullery maid to Evelyn herself, reported nightmares of standing in the manor's ballroom, surrounded by wedding guests who melted like candle wax before their eyes, their features running in rivulets of flesh to reveal something inhuman beneath. Some dreamed of a door appearing in the middle of the empty ballroom, opening onto a darkness filled with reaching hands. Others described a green light that poured through the windows, turning everything it touched to ash. Many awoke screaming, sheets soaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. 2 housemaids gave notice, preferring unemployment to another night under the Thorn roof. The stable master reported that the horses had become increasingly agitated, refusing to enter certain parts of the stable and sometimes rearing in terror at nothing visible to human eyes. Evelyn dismissed these incidents as nerves, the natural anxieties that precede any significant life change amplified by the superstitious nature of household staff. Her siblings were less certain. 16-year-old William, the youngest Thorn, became so troubled that he begged Evelyn to elope instead. "There's something wrong with father," he insisted during a private moment in the garden. "Haven't you noticed how he stares at that old book from the attic? How he mutters to himself when he thinks no one is listening? Last night I heard him in the library. He wasn't alone, Evelyn. He was speaking to someone, but when I looked through the keyhole, there was no one else in the room." Charlotte, 19 and the closest to Evelyn in both age and temperament, reported similar concerns. "He's been visiting the family crypt at midnight," she whispered one afternoon as they sorted wedding gifts. "I saw him from my window. He carried no lamp, yet moved as if he could see perfectly in the darkness, and he was carrying something, a bundle wrapped in cloth that moved." The middle children, twins Henry and Eleanor, age 21, added their own observations. Eleanor had found strange symbols chalked on the underside of furniture in the ballroom, while Henry had discovered a locked room in the cellar that had never existed before, its door warm to the touch despite the underground chill. But Evelyn was determined to see her wedding day come to pass. After years of believing her love for James would never be sanctioned, she would not be deterred by superstition and childish fears. She attributed the household's collective unease to the disruption of routine, her father's uncharacteristic behavior to the natural emotion of a man preparing to give away his eldest daughter. When her siblings pressed their concerns, she reminded them of the opportunities this marriage would bring, not just for her, but for James and, by extension, a working-class Irish family that had never dreamed of such advancement. In private moments, however, even Evelyn could not entirely dismiss a growing sense of wrongness. The way her father watched her now, not with the expected mixture of pride and resignation, but with a calculating assessment that made her feel less like a bride and more like a prized heifer being readied for market. The strange emphasis he placed on specific details of the ceremony, particularly the timing of the vows and the positioning of guests in the ballroom, his new habit of measuring her with his eyes, as if confirming she matched some internal specification. These doubts she kept to herself, sharing them neither with James nor with her siblings. Too much depended on this wedding proceeding as planned. Too many hopes, too many futures. If the price of her happiness was enduring a few weeks of strangeness and unsettling dreams, it seemed a small cost to bear. The day of the wedding dawned crisp and clear. October 15th, 1871. The trees surrounding Thorn Manor blazed with autumn color, crimson, amber, and burnished gold. Inside, the house had been transformed. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, roses, chrysanthemums, and dahlia blossoms arranged in artful displays. Candles by the hundreds waited to be lit as evening approached, promising to bathe the proceedings in golden light. The household had been awake since before dawn, servants moving with the precision of a well-drilled military unit, despite the dark circles beneath many eyes testifying to another night of troubled sleep. The ballroom, unused for years, had been restored to its former glory. The parquet floor gleamed from hours of polishing. Crystal chandeliers sparkled, each prism casting rainbow reflections across walls freshly painted in cream and gold. Long windows that occupied nearly the entire eastern wall would capture the setting sun perfectly as the ceremony began. Evelyn awoke feeling strangely calm, the anxieties of previous weeks replaced by a dreamlike acceptance. Her sisters and 2 cousins who had arrived the day before helped her prepare, their chatter filling her bedchamber with a welcome normality. Her wedding gown, when finally donned, proved more beautiful than she had dared hope, the silk shimmering like captured moonlight, the lace overlay delicate as spun frost, tiny seed pearls catching the light with every movement. Downstairs, Ezekiel moved through the house with unusual energy for a man his age, personally inspecting every arrangement, adjusting the position of chairs in the ballroom by mere inches, ensuring that each candle was precisely the right height. He had dressed with particular care in a suit of such deep black it seemed to absorb light, a blood-red waistcoat providing the only touch of color. The family signet ring, normally worn on his right hand, had been moved to his left, a detail noticed by Mrs. Winters with quiet concern, but not remarked upon. Guests began arriving at 3 o'clock. Carriages lined the winding drive as far as the eye could see, disgorging Virginia's elite in their finest attire. The Thorntons from Charlottesville, old money with Revolutionary War connections, the Westfields from Richmond, banking magnates whose influence extended to Washington, the Blackwoods from Lexington, whose timber operations rivaled the Thorns' own. Even Governor Gilbert Walker made an appearance, a testament to the Thorn family's influence despite their Confederate affiliations during the recent conflict. Each arrival was greeted at the door by Ezekiel himself rather than the butler, as would be customary, another departure from protocol that raised eyebrows but was attributed to a father's pride on his daughter's wedding day. Each guest was personally escorted to a specific seat in the ballroom, Ezekiel consulting a small notebook to ensure precise placement. When several guests attempted to change seats to sit near friends, Ezekiel intervened with firm insistence on the arranged order, citing acoustics and family tradition in a tone that brooked no argument. The Sullivan contingent arrived together at 4, dressed in their finest clothes, though these were visibly simpler than the elaborate fashions of the upper-class guests. Thomas Sullivan wore a new suit purchased specially for the occasion, the stiff collar clearly uncomfortable against his weathered neck. Bridget had chosen a dress of deep blue that complemented her still dark hair, touched only lightly with silver at the temples. James's 3 younger siblings followed, wide-eyed at the opulence surrounding them. Most notable was Bridget's demeanor as she crossed the threshold of Thorn Manor. She clutched a rosary in her hand, her lips moving in silent prayer. When Ezekiel stepped forward to greet them, she made the sign of the cross before offering her hand, a gesture that caused a ripple of amusement among some of the Virginia gentry, but was received by Ezekiel with an understanding nod, as if he recognized the protective intention behind the motion. "Welcome to our family, Mrs. Sullivan," he said with unexpected warmth. "Your son will make my Evelyn very happy, I'm certain." "If God wills it," Bridget responded, her Irish accent stronger than usual, betraying her nervousness. "Indeed," Ezekiel replied, a strange smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Though some might say we make our own fate in this world." He placed the Sullivans in the front row on the right side of the aisle, a position of honor that surprised everyone, especially Thomas Sullivan, who had expected to be relegated to the back of the room. James had arrived separately and earlier, sequestered in a small study off the main hallway where his groomsmen, two fellow workers from the ironworks who looked profoundly uncomfortable in their formal attire, attempted to calm his nerves with awkward jokes and a flask of whiskey passed surreptitiously between them. By 5 o'clock, all 108 guests were assembled. The ceremony was to take place in the manor's grand ballroom, where an archway had been constructed and decorated with white roses and trailing ivy. Chairs arranged in neat rows faced the makeshift altar, where Reverend Thomas Holloway from the Millborough Springs Episcopal Church waited to perform the ceremony. A tall, thin man with a perpetual expression of mild surprise, Reverend Holloway had been ministering to the Thorn family for over a decade, baptizing the younger children and burying Margaret Thorn 3 years prior. The Reverend had expressed initial reservations about performing a ceremony between an Episcopalian bride and a Catholic groom, but had been persuaded by Ezekiel's assurance that the Sullivans had consented to an Episcopal service. This was, in fact, not entirely true. James had agreed, but Bridget had protested until Thomas had gently reminded her that they were in no position to dictate terms. "The girl is a thorn," he had said. "If our James wants her, he'll have to bend more than his knee." As 5:30 approached, a curious phenomenon occurred that would later be noted in multiple witness accounts. The quality of light in the ballroom began to change subtly. The late afternoon sun streaming through the tall eastern windows took on a golden hue more intense than natural, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Several guests commented on the effect, assuming it was some clever arrangement of mirrors or colored glass intended as a decorative element. Ezekiel Thorn moved among his guests with uncharacteristic charm, a smile fixed upon his usually stern face. He personally greeted each attendee, clasping hands and thanking them for sharing in this momentous occasion. Those who knew him well noted something unusual in his manner, a feverish quality to his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands, but attributed it to a father's natural emotion on his daughter's wedding day. More observant guests might have noticed that he spent slightly longer with certain attendees, particularly those seated at specific points around the ballroom, the four corners, the center of each row, and every seventh seat in the front row. To these individuals, he offered not just greetings, but a small token, a sprig of an unfamiliar herb with tiny white flowers, which he instructed them to keep on their person throughout the ceremony. An old family tradition, he explained, for luck and prosperity. At precisely 5:45, the string quartet positioned in a corner of the ballroom began to play Mendelssohn's Wedding March. The guests settled into their seats, necks craning to catch the first glimpse of the bride. James stood at the altar, resplendent in a new suit of charcoal gray, his usual workman's stubble replaced by a clean-shaven jawline, his dark hair tamed with pomade into an uncharacteristically smooth style. His expression was a mixture of nervousness and undisguised joy, his eyes fixed on the double doors at the back of the ballroom. The music swelled, and those doors swung open to reveal Evelyn in the doorway on her father's arm. A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests. Her gown was more exquisite than rumor had suggested, the bodice adorned with seed pearls that caught the light with every movement, the skirt falling in perfect folds to brush the floor as she moved. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure, topped with a crown of orange blossoms and trailing a veil of delicate lace that partially obscured her features, but couldn't hide the radiance of her smile. She was, in that moment, the very picture of a Victorian bride, beautiful, demure, and radiantly happy. Yet those nearest the aisle, particularly those with keener perception, might have noticed something else beneath the conventional bridal glow, a certain fixity to her gaze, almost trance-like, as if she were walking in a dream rather than fully present in the moment. As father and daughter processed down the aisle, observers noted the expression on Ezekiel's face. Where one might expect to see pride or even resigned acceptance, there was instead a look of intense satisfaction, almost triumph. His spine was straighter than usual, his step more vigorous, as if the ceremony were infusing him with energy rather than marking the bittersweet transition of releasing a beloved child to a new life. When they reached the altar and Reverend Holloway asked, "Who gives this woman in marriage?" Ezekiel's voice rang out with unusual force. "I do, with the blessings of all who came before me." The phrasing caused the Reverend to blink in momentary confusion, the traditional response being simply "I do" or "her mother and I do," but he recovered quickly and proceeded with the ceremony as planned. As Ezekiel took his seat in the front row, several guests would later recall that he removed a small book from his pocket and placed it on his lap, his fingers resting on its worn leather cover throughout the proceedings. Those closest might have noticed that the book bore no title, its binding unusually ancient, the leather discolored with age and what appeared to be darker stains along the spine. The ceremony proceeded according to tradition. Reverend Holloway's voice rang clearly through the ballroom as he spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the responsibilities of husband and wife, the divine blessing bestowed upon this sacred union. Scriptures were read, passages from Genesis, Corinthians, and the Psalms that have accompanied Christian weddings for centuries. When the time came for vows to be exchanged, James spoke his with clear confidence, his Irish accent more pronounced than usual under the stress of the moment, but his meaning unmistakable: to love, honor, and cherish Evelyn for all the days of his life. As he spoke, his gaze never left her face, his expression one of wonder that such happiness could be his. Evelyn's response was equally clear, though delivered in a softer voice that nevertheless carried to the farthest corners of the ballroom. Those who knew her well might have detected a slight hesitation before certain phrases, particularly "till death do us part," but attributed this to the natural emotion of the moment rather than any deeper significance. Rings were presented, simple gold bands that James had purchased with months of saved wages, though Ezekiel had offered to provide something more elaborate. "Let what binds them be bought with his own hands," he had said, an unusually poetic sentiment from a man typically concerned with material displays of wealth and status. As the rings were blessed and exchanged, another subtle change occurred in the ballroom's atmosphere. The golden light from the windows deepened, taking on an amber hue that gradually shifted toward something less natural, a tinge of green that was slight at first, but grew more pronounced with each passing minute. Again, guests assumed this was an intentional effect, perhaps from colored lanterns being lit outside as the sun began to set. Finally, after the last prayer was spoken and the final blessing bestowed, Reverend Holloway pronounced them, man and wife. "You may now kiss your bride," the Reverend instructed with a benevolent smile. James took Evelyn's hands in his. For a moment they simply gazed at one another, scarcely able to believe they had reached this point against all odds. Then, slowly, he leaned forward to claim his first kiss as her husband. Their lips met as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the high windows of the ballroom, bathing the newlyweds in a light that had now undeniably shifted from golden to a pale, luminous green. The moment should have been perfect, the culmination of a love story that had overcome substantial obstacles. Instead, it marked the beginning of a mystery that would never be solved. As their kiss lingered, the quality of light in the room continued to change. What had been golden became increasingly alien, a greenish hue that cast sickly shadows across the faces of the guests. A low humming sound filled the air, barely perceptible at first, but growing steadily louder until it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into the bones of everyone present. Evelyn was the first to notice something was wrong. Breaking away from James, she turned toward the assembled guests with alarm. What she saw defied explanation. Every person in the room, from the highest lady to the lowliest servant standing at the back, appeared frozen in place. Their expressions were locked in the polite smiles and tender gazes of moments before, but their eyes were wide with dawning horror. Ezekiel alone seemed unaffected. He had risen from his seat, the strange leather-bound book now open in his hands, his lips moving in what appeared to be a recitation, though no sound emerged over the increasing hum that filled the room. "Father!" Evelyn's voice was barely audible above the noise. "What's happening? What have you done?" Before Ezekiel could respond, if indeed he intended to, the humming reached a crescendo. The green light pulsed once, twice, then flared with blinding intensity. Several guests managed to break from their paralysis enough to scream, the sounds cutting through the hum like knives through silk. Before anyone could speak or move further, a cold wind swept through the ballroom, though all windows and doors remained closed. The candles flickered wildly, then extinguished all at once, plunging the space into premature darkness broken only by the unnatural green glow that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. In the chaotic minutes that followed, James held tightly to Evelyn's hand, refusing to be separated from his new bride despite the panicked crowd. He tried to pull her toward the exit, but she resisted, her eyes fixed on her father, who now stood with arms outstretched, the book hovering before him without visible support, its pages turning of their own accord. "We need to get out of here," James urged, tugging at her hand with increasing desperation. "We can't leave them," Evelyn protested, gesturing to the guests who seemed caught between paralysis and panic, some frozen completely while others moved in slow motion, as if struggling against invisible bonds. Then, in a moment that would haunt James Sullivan for the remainder of his life, he saw something impossible. At the center of the ballroom, directly beneath the largest chandelier, the air itself appeared to tear open. There was no other way to describe it. A vertical split in reality, widening to reveal not the wall behind it, but a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb the greenish light rather than be illuminated by it. From this darkness emerged something. Later, in the nightmares that would plague him for decades, James would never be able to describe exactly what he had seen. His mind, as human minds will, had translated the incomprehensible into more familiar terms, reaching hands, hungry mouths, eyes that were not eyes but served the same function. The impression was of hunger, of ancient patience finally rewarded, of a bargain reaching fruition. Ezekiel's voice rose above the cacophony of screams and the omnipresent humming, speaking words in no language James recognized. In response, the tear in reality widened further. What happened next occurred with such speed that witnesses would later contradict not only each other but themselves in attempting to describe it. The green light intensified to an unbearable degree. The tear in reality expanded until it seemed to touch the walls of the ballroom on either side. Ezekiel Thorn shouted a final phrase that ended in his daughter's name. And then, in an instant that stretched like eternity, every guest in the ballroom began to move not of their own volition, but as if pulled by an irresistible force. They slid across the polished floor toward the central tear, their heels leaving scuff marks on the perfect parquet, their hands grasping uselessly at empty air. Some went silently, eyes wide with terror beyond screaming. Others fought to the last, their cries cutting off abruptly as they reached the threshold of the impossible doorway and vanished into the darkness beyond. Ezekiel himself was the last to go, but unlike the others, he stepped willingly into the void, the book clutched to his chest, a look of ecstatic fulfillment on his face as the darkness enveloped him. Before James could fully comprehend what he was witnessing, the tear contracted with the suddenness of a blink. The green light vanished. The humming ceased. The candles reignited all at once, casting normal golden light across a ballroom that was now empty, save for James, Evelyn, and the handful of servants who had been outside the room when whatever had occurred took place. Servants rushed in with oil lamps, their faces pale with fright as they took in the scene, a ballroom set for a wedding reception with chairs overturned, personal items scattered across the floor, fans, handkerchiefs, pocket watches dropped in panic, but not one of the 108 wedding guests in sight. As light gradually returned to the room, the impossible scene revealed itself in its full horror. The ballroom was empty, save for James, Evelyn, and the servants who had come from other parts of the house. All 108 wedding guests had vanished without a trace. No doors had opened, no windows had been disturbed, yet the entire assembly, including Ezekiel Thorn himself, had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. The initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by panic. The remaining servants, along with James and Evelyn, searched every room of the vast manor. They called names into empty corridors, flung open closet doors, even checked the cellars and attics. As night fell in earnest, they extended their search to the grounds, carrying lanterns through the gardens, the orchards, the woods beyond. Not a single guest was found, not a footprint in the soft earth of the garden paths, not a snapped twig along the forest trails, not one witness who had seen a procession of over 100 people leave the property. By midnight, James had sent riders to fetch the sheriff from Milborough Springs and to alert neighboring farms and estates. The sheriff, a practical man named Joseph Bennett who had served in the position for 15 years, arrived shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, accompanied by 2 deputies. His initial skepticism, assuming an elaborate prank or perhaps a mass departure in protest of the mixed-class marriage, gave way to genuine concern as the facts became clear. "You're telling me over 100 people just vanished?" he asked James, his expression caught between disbelief and growing alarm. "I know how it sounds," James replied, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting names into the darkness. "But I swear on my mother's life, Sheriff. 1 minute they were there, the next they were gone." The sheriff's investigation that night revealed nothing beyond what was already apparent: chairs overturned in haste, personal belongings abandoned, and a series of scuff marks across the ballroom floor that converged at a central point before stopping abruptly. Most disturbing was the condition of that central point, a circular area approximately 6 feet in diameter where the previously immaculate parquet was now discolored and warped, the wood blackened as if exposed to intense heat, though no fire had been reported. By dawn, a formal search had been organized involving every able-bodied man from the surrounding areas. For 3 days, they combed the countryside, dragged Chestnut Creek, and investigated every abandoned building, mineshaft, and cave within 10 miles of Thorn Manor. Nothing. No one. The guests of the Thorn Sullivan wedding had simply ceased to exist. In the weeks that followed, theories abounded. Some suggested a mass hallucination. Perhaps something in the wedding feast had caused collective delusions, but the food had been consumed by the servants as well, who remained unaffected. Others whispered of secret passages within the old house, a planned disappearance orchestrated by Ezekiel Thorn for reasons unknown. The more superstitious spoke of divine punishment, of deals with the devil, of ancient curses awakened by the mixing of bloods that should have remained separate. The prevailing theory among more rational minds centered on kidnapping, an elaborate plot to abduct wealthy members of Virginia society for ransom. This theory gained traction when the days passed without any ransom demands, forcing authorities to consider the grim possibility of mass murder instead. Yet no bodies were found, no blood evidence discovered despite thorough examination of the manor and grounds. The investigation eventually expanded to include authorities from Richmond and even federal agents intrigued by the unprecedented nature of the case. They interviewed everyone connected to the event: the dressmaker who had fitted Evelyn's gown, the florist who had provided the arrangements, the merchants who had supplied the feast. They studied the guest list exhaustively, tracking the backgrounds of each missing person, searching for connections beyond the obvious social ties. One agent became particularly interested in Ezekiel Thorn's activities in the weeks preceding the wedding. A methodical man named Frederick Harrison with experience investigating financial crimes, Agent Harrison approached the case from an angle others had overlooked. Rather than focusing solely on the disappearance itself, he began examining Ezekiel's business dealings, personal history, and correspondence. Interviews with Thorn's business associates revealed unusual transactions: the liquidation of significant assets, the transfer of property deeds, the settlement of all outstanding debts. It appeared that Ezekiel had been preparing for something momentous, putting his affairs in order with meticulous care. Most telling was the discovery made in Ezekiel's study during a second, more thorough search of the manor. A hidden compartment behind a false panel in the fireplace mantel contained documents that painted a disturbing picture: letters exchanged with obscure scholars in Europe and Egypt, astronomical charts marking specific alignments of stars and planets with October 15, 1871, circled in red ink, genealogical records of the Thorn family stretching back centuries with certain marriages marked with strange symbols. And most disturbing of all, a leather-bound volume written in a language none could identify, filled with diagrams of astronomical alignments and anatomical drawings that disturbed even the most hardened investigators. The book appeared ancient, its pages made of a material that experts could not conclusively identify, not quite parchment, not quite paper, with an unsettling texture that one scholar described as too similar to human skin for comfort. Tucked between its pages was a family tree of the Thorn lineage dating back to the early 1600s. Beside Evelyn's name, a notation in Ezekiel's handwriting: the 100th Bride. The circle closes. What this meant, no one could determine. The book was sent to scholars at various universities, but none could translate the text or make sense of the diagrams. Eventually, like the missing guests themselves, the volume disappeared from a locked evidence room in Richmond, furthering the aura of inexplicable mystery surrounding the case. For James and Evelyn, the aftermath of their wedding day was devastating. Their joy had turned to horror, their future suddenly uncertain. Evelyn was particularly affected by her father's disappearance. Despite his initial opposition to the marriage, he was still her father. The thought that he might have orchestrated something sinister was too painful to consider, yet the evidence increasingly pointed in that direction. In the weeks following the incident, Evelyn withdrew into herself. She would sit for hours in her father's study, surrounded by his books, as if trying to piece together from his possessions the truth of what had occurred. She began collecting all references to Thorn family history she could find, creating a timeline of events stretching back to the family's arrival in Virginia. What she discovered disturbed her deeply. The Thorns had not come to America as the successful merchant's family law suggested. According to parish records from England that she obtained through correspondence with a historian in London, the first Thorn to set foot in the colonies had fled under suspicious circumstances following the deaths of 13 villagers in a small hamlet in Northumberland, deaths that coincided with the marriage of his eldest son. With this knowledge weighing on her, Evelyn became obsessed with understanding her family's true history and the role she had unwittingly played in whatever had transpired on her wedding day. She began experiencing episodes where she would speak in languages she had never studied, reciting what seemed to be portions of the text from the missing book. These episodes left her exhausted and frightened, with no memory of what she had said. With Ezekiel gone and no other immediate family present at the wedding, Evelyn's siblings had been deemed too young to attend and had been staying with relatives in Charlottesville. The Thorn estate fell to Evelyn as the eldest child. She and James found themselves sudden stewards of vast property and wealth, a position that brought little comfort under the circumstances. James, for his part, struggled with helplessness and guilt. His family, parents, siblings, cousins had all been among the vanished guests. Every night he relived the moment when they had disappeared, questioning if there had been something he could have done, some way he could have saved them. The vision of his mother's face, frozen in horror as she slid across the floor toward that impossible tear in reality, haunted his dreams and often woke him screaming in the night. Despite these personal traumas, both James and Evelyn cooperated fully with the ongoing investigation. They recounted the events of that day countless times to increasingly skeptical authorities, never wavering in their account despite the incredulity with which it was received. They provided access to every part of Thorn Manor, every document, every potential clue that might shed light on the mystery. As months passed with no resolution, public fascination with the case began to wane. The investigation remained open but inactive. The newlyweds were left to forge a life together in the shadow of inexplicable tragedy. They chose not to remain at Thorn Manor. The house stood empty, its rooms silent witnesses to whatever had transpired that October evening. Local legends quickly took root, stories of lights seen in the windows at night, of spectral music drifting across the grounds on the anniversary of the wedding, of travelers who ventured too close, disappearing without a trace. James and Evelyn moved first to Richmond, then farther north to Philadelphia, seeking a fresh start and anonymity. They had 3 children in the years that followed, 2 sons and a daughter. Though acquaintances noted that Evelyn was never quite the same after the events of her wedding day, a certain melancholy hung about her, deepening as she aged. She developed an obsessive interest in spiritualism, attending seances and consulting mediums in a desperate attempt to contact her vanished father and learn the truth of what had happened. James devoted himself to his family and to building a new business far removed from the Thorn holdings, which were eventually sold. He rarely spoke of the wedding day, but friends reported that he suffered from chronic nightmares. On particularly bad nights, he would wake screaming about green light and faces melting into smoke. The mystery might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for a startling development. 23 years later, in 1894, a routine excavation for a railway line near Milborough Springs uncovered a mass grave less than 2 miles from the former site of Thorn Manor. Within the grave were the remains of exactly 108 individuals. The coroner's examination revealed several puzzling details. First, despite being buried for over 2 decades, the bodies showed minimal decomposition. The flesh had desiccated but not rotted, giving the corpses an appearance more like Egyptian mummies than typical remains of that age. Second, none bore any obvious cause of death, no wounds, no signs of disease or poisoning. It was as if they had simply stopped living at the exact same moment. Most disturbing of all, each corpse wore an expression of abject terror, mouths frozen in silent screams, hands curled into claws as if they had fought desperately against some unseen force. Clothing and personal effects identified the remains as those of the missing wedding guests. Ezekiel Thorn was among them, distinguished by his signet ring and the silver watch his own father had given him upon his 21st birthday. Unlike the others, his expression was not one of terror, but of something closer to rapture, his lips drawn back in what might have been a smile or a final gasp. The discovery caused a sensation in the press. Newspapers across the country carried headlines about the Thorn wedding mystery and the Virginia burial pit. Spiritualists and scientists alike descended on Bath County, each eager to investigate the phenomenon according to their own methodologies. News of the discovery reached James and Evelyn in Philadelphia. James immediately traveled to Virginia to assist with the identification process and to arrange proper burials for the Sullivan family members who had been among the victims. Evelyn, however, refused to return. By this time, her mental state had deteriorated significantly. The news of the found bodies pushed her over the edge she had been teetering on for years. In the days following James' departure for Virginia, those close to Evelyn noticed alarming changes in her behavior. She became feverishly active, sorting through old papers, making cryptic notations in a journal, and speaking urgently about completing the circle and the 100th bride's duty. Her oldest son, Thomas, named for the grandfather he had never met, reported that she had begun sleepwalking, always following the same pattern, standing at the center of whatever room she was in and extending her arms as if opening an invisible door. On the night James was due to return from Virginia, Evelyn locked herself in their bedroom and opened her veins in the bathtub. She left behind a note containing just 7 words: "The 100th bride must complete the circle." Her suicide added a final tragic chapter to the already haunting story. James was devastated, forced to bury his wife of 23 years alongside arranging funerals for his long-missing parents and siblings. Their children, 2 sons and a daughter, were left to grapple with not only their mother's suicide, but also the resurgence of the infamous mystery that had shadowed their family name since before they were born. The discovery of the bodies and Evelyn's subsequent suicide reignited public interest in the case. New investigations were launched, employing the more advanced forensic techniques available at the century's end. Soil samples from the mass grave were analyzed, the strange lack of decomposition was studied by medical experts, the Thorn family history was scrutinized more thoroughly than ever before. These investigations yielded disturbing connections that had been overlooked in the original inquiry. The Thorn lineage, it emerged, had a pattern of unusual weddings stretching back generations. Every 3rd generation, a Thorn bride or groom was wed during the October full moon. And following each such wedding, local records showed clusters of unexplained disappearances in the surrounding communities. Ezekiel's grandfather, Josiah Thorn, had married on October 26, 1811. In the week following his wedding, 7 people from neighboring farms vanished without explanation. His great-grandfather, Caleb Thorn, was married on October 18, 1751. The entire crew of a merchant vessel docked in Chesapeake Bay, 12 men in total, disappeared the night of his wedding celebration. Further investigation revealed even older incidents, more difficult to verify, but consistent with the pattern. The Thorn family, it seemed, had been marked by mysterious disappearances since their arrival in the American colonies in the mid-1600s. And before that, genealogical records traced their origins to a small village in northern England, where similar legends had surrounded the family for centuries. Most significant was the discovery of references to the 100th bride in Thorn family correspondence dating back to 1729. A letter from Obadiah Thorn to his son contained a cryptic warning: "Remember the count continues unbroken. Each union brings us closer to the 100th bride, when our covenant will be fulfilled and our sacrifice rewarded." Mathematicians and genealogists collaborated to analyze the Thorn family tree. Counting every marriage in the direct line and specific branch marriages that had occurred on October full moons, They determined that Evelyn had indeed been the 100th bride in a sequence stretching back almost 3 centuries. But what covenant? What sacrifice? What reward? These questions remained unanswered, the full truth hidden behind the veil that separates the known world from whatever lies beyond. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the case of the vanishing wedding guests gradually receded once more into the realm of legend. The Sullivan children changed their surname to distance themselves from the notoriety. Thorn Manor was eventually demolished after a fire of mysterious origin gutted the main house in 1902, leaving only the stone foundation and a single chimney standing like an accusing finger pointed at the sky. The land was reclaimed by forest, nature quickly erasing the physical evidence of human habitation. Only the family cemetery remained, surrounded by a high wrought iron fence and rarely visited except by those with a morbid fascination for the macabre. The story might have been forgotten entirely if not for a curious incident. In 1921, a historian named Dr. Malcolm Pierce, researching a book on Virginia's unsolved mysteries, visited the former site of Thorn Manor on October 15, exactly 50 years after the infamous wedding. Dr. Pierce was a skeptic, a man of science who had made his reputation debunking supernatural claims with careful research and logical explanations. He had planned to spend the night camping on the property, hoping to demonstrate that the reports of strange phenomena associated with the anniversary were nothing more than suggestible minds influenced by a compelling legend. He was never seen again. His equipment was found abandoned near the ruins of the house, a camera with unexposed film, a journal containing detailed notes on the Thorn case, and a curious sketch of what appeared to be a doorway standing open in empty air with shadowy figures emerging from within. The last entry in his journal, written in increasingly erratic handwriting that began in Pierce's usual meticulous script but deteriorated into barely legible scrawl by the final lines, read, "The circle is not closed. It waits still. I can hear them whispering beneath the earth. They say another bride must come. The door opens both ways. God help us all." A thorough search of the area yielded nothing. Pierce's colleagues at the University of Virginia, where he had been a respected professor of American history, offered rewards for information leading to his discovery. Spiritualists claimed to have contacted his spirit, reporting that he was beyond the veil but unwilling or unable to describe his location more specifically. Eventually, like the original wedding guests, Pierce became another footnote in the expanding legend of Thorn Manor, another life swallowed by whatever darkness lingered on that isolated Virginia hillside. This final disappearance cemented the legend of the Thorn wedding in the annals of American folklore. Various adaptations appeared in ghost story collections and around campfires. Hollywood produced a loosely inspired film in the 1950s that bore little resemblance to the actual events. The truth became increasingly obscured by embellishment and sensationalism. Yet for those willing to dig deeper, to sift historical fact from supernatural fiction, the core mystery remains as compelling as it is unsettling. 108 people vanished in an instant from a sealed room, their bodies appeared 23 years later, inexplicably preserved and bearing expressions of unspeakable terror, and throughout it all runs the thread of an ancient covenant, a generational countdown, and a circle that somehow, despite everything, remains incomplete. What truly happened at the Thorn-Sullivan wedding? Was it, as skeptics maintain, an elaborate hoax orchestrated by Ezekiel Thorn, a final act of revenge against the man who had stolen his daughter, culminating in mass murder by some undetectable poison? Was it, as some theologians suggest, divine retribution for generations of secret sin? Or was it something far older and more terrible, a pact with forces beyond human understanding, temporarily fulfilled, but eternally hungry? The answers, if they exist, are lost to history. The principles are long dead, the physical evidence scattered or destroyed, the written records fragmented and contradictory. All that remains is the story itself, a cautionary tale of ambition, forbidden love, and the terrible price paid when ancient boundaries are crossed. Perhaps it's better that we don't know the full truth. Some mysteries, once solved, reveal horrors the human mind was never meant to comprehend. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Yet for those drawn to the darkness, the questions persist. What was the nature of the Thorn family's covenant? What power demanded such a specific sacrifice? The 100th bride, the assembled witnesses, And most chilling of all, if the circle remains unclosed, as the vanished historian believed, what further price will be exacted to complete it? These questions have echoed through the decades since that fateful day in 1871, when a kiss sealed not only a marriage, but the fate of over 100 souls. They whisper still among the overgrown ruins where Thorn Manor once stood proud against the Virginia sky. They rustle in the pages of old newspapers and county records. They haunt the dreams of those who delve too deeply into the story. For the curious and the brave, the trail begins in the county archives of Bath County, Virginia, where the original investigation reports gather dust in forgotten files. It continues in the special collections of the University of Virginia Library, where fragments of Ezekiel Thorn's strange book are preserved under glass, having resurfaced in 1967 in the possession of a private collector who donated them anonymously after experiencing what he described as visitations that left him unable to sleep. The trail winds through crumbling churchyards where some of the recovered bodies were laid to rest, their gravestones bearing only names and a shared death date, October 15, 1871. But a word of warning to those who might pursue this mystery. According to local legend, anyone who gets too close to the truth begins to dream of a grand ballroom filled with smiling guests, of green light pouring through high windows, and of faces that melt like wax as an unseen door opens onto endless night. And on October nights, when the moon is full and the veil between worlds grows thin, it's said that the sounds of string music can be heard in the forest where Thorn Manor once stood. The melody is sweet at first, enticing, drawing the listener deeper among the trees. But those who follow it too far report that the tune gradually changes, becoming discordant and strange until it sounds less like music and more like screams. Some doors are best left closed. Some kisses should remain ungiven. Some circles are safer left incomplete. But the story of the Thorn wedding endures, a whisper passed from one generation to the next, a shadow that refuses to fade with the passage of time. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of those 108 guests still gather at an eternal reception, trapped between moments, waiting for a resolution that may never come. Or perhaps they wait for the 101st bride, and the final closing of the circle that began centuries ago with a desperate bargain made by the first Thorn to set foot on American soil, a bargain written in blood and sealed with a kiss. The most disturbing aspect of this tale, perhaps, is its cyclical nature. Every 50 years since the original incident, strange occurrences have been reported in the vicinity of the former Thorn property. In 1921, the historian vanished. In 1971, a group of college students camping near the ruins reported seeing a green glow among the trees and hearing wedding music on the wind. 2 of their number wandered off to investigate and were never seen again. And now, as 2021 approaches, one might wonder what the anniversary will bring. Already, locals report unusual activity in the area, electronic devices malfunctioning, animals behaving erratically, strange lights glimpsed through the trees on moonless nights. The few remaining descendants of families connected to the original event have reported dreams of wedding invitations written in green ink, arriving in envelopes sealed with wax bearing the Thorn family crest. Is it merely suggestion, the power of a compelling story to influence susceptible minds? Or is something stirring in the Virginia hills, preparing once more to open a door that should remain forever closed? Sleep well, dear viewers. And if you should dream tonight of wedding bells and vanishing guests, remember, it's only a story. Isn't it? This has been the Gastly Journal. Until next time, keep to the light, and beware the shadows where older things still hunger.